One of the newest and most exciting archaeological excavations around the Sea of Galilee is with the city of Magdala. And for the longest time, I never realized how important the city was to the life and ministry of Jesus around the Sea of Galilee. So let's dive into part 5 and see who's residing in Magdala and why this was so critical to the advancement of the gospel through Jesus Christ. Well, everyone, we have been bouncing all around the Sea of Galilee. We started with the Herodians of Tiberias, we went to the religious Jews of the Triangle, we went over to the pagans of the Decapolis, and now we're crossing the sea once again to the west side to the place of Magdala. And Magdala came up in an earlier episode when Brad Nelson showed the proximity between Magdala and Tiberias with Mount Arbel here. And if we swing the drone shot around a little bit to the north and look back down the shoreline, you can see Magdala sits here and Tiberias is 3.5 miles to the south of it. Magdala is at the base of Mount Arbel, and if we now take a shot this way, you can see this is the top of Mount Arbel, and this is where that international coastal highway came through and connected to Magdala as it continued to work its way up north around the shoreline. And Magdala itself is a remarkable city in the first century world, and it's a remarkable excavation as well. In fact, Josephus, the first century historian, tells us that 30,000 people resided in Magdala. Now, if you'll recall, we went to Capernaum, Chorazin, Bethsaida, and each of those locations we said, yeah, it's about 1,500 people, okay, maybe give or take 500 people. You go down the shoreline to Tiberias, minimum of 15,000. Herod Antipas moved his capital there in AD 20, so it was still being built up. It was relatively young during Jesus' ministry. So we know there's at least 15,000 there. Magdala has 30,000 people. We are talking about a significant city on the Sea of Galilee. Now, the name Magdala is actually Aramaic. The Hebrew is Migdal, Magdala, Migdal. You can hear the linguistic connection there between Aramaic and Hebrew. And they both mean the exact same thing, tower. And it's in reference to a salting tower or a smoking tower for fish, which is what the Greek name of the location remembers. So the Greek name of Magdala is Terche, and it means salted fish. And when you walk the premises of the archaeological excavations, you can see the foundations of a square tower where that took place right there. Now, a fun connection to be aware of is that in Matthew 5, we're in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth." And some of you will remember from the last episode, Brad talked about how you are the light of the world, being in reference to Hippus, the only city that was on a hill around the Sea of Galilee that would be lit up at night and could not be hidden. I think Jesus is also making a reference to Magdala when he says, "You are the salt of the earth." Magdala was the salting center around the Sea of Galilee. And what's so cool is that the Sermon on the Mount is traditionally right here, which means that Jesus had line of sight to both Magdala and to Hippus. That when Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world," like he can literally go there, and there's a visual for people to lock in what he is saying. You know, it's so cool to think about how strategic Jesus was in his communication to provide physical illustrations that would allow people to remember his core ideas, to anchor it into something that they could see, something that they would engage with, and Jesus does this all the time. And here's just a beautiful shot of the Mount of Beatitudes, and again, Magdala being right over here, and then Hippus being in this direction over here. Well, let's jump back into the site itself, because when we start talking about Magdala, some of you are already making connections to something in our Gospels. And it's with respect to a person, a woman in particular, by the name of Mary Magdalene. And Mary Magdalene is from Magdala. That's what Magdalene is referring to. And the reason why we have this designation of where she's from, it's not a last name, it's a location name, is to distinguish her from the other Marys that we find in the Gospels. And we have a lot of Marys in the Gospels, which in English it's Mary, in Hebrew it's Miriam. It was one of the most popular names for a woman in the first century world. And so we have this designation of Magdalene to set her apart from the other Marys. And what's more, it's not just Mary Magdalene, it's the Mary Magdalene who is referenced 12 times in our gospel stories. It's the same person who was the first to see the resurrected Jesus Christ. And that Mary is from this place right here. It's just a fantastic location for a number of reasons. Now, when you come into the site, the main place that you are led to is a structure that preserves a synagogue. And not just any synagogue, a synagogue that dates from the time of Jesus, which is huge because when we went to the cities of the Triangle, you don't have one in Bethsaida that's been found, but the one in Chorazin, the one in Capernaum, I said they're synagogues that date to a later time than Jesus. And here in Magdala, we have one from the first century. Now, one of the other things I mentioned when we talked about the evangelical triangles, we talked about what made religious Jews. And these were people who were passionate about following the scriptures. They lived in community, in insula, and they were always gathering together at the synagogue where this all came together. Now, these are religious Jews that were in the Triangle, but the Triangle wasn't the only place that had religious Jews. We've also got them in Magdala, and it's witnessed with that synagogue. What's more, notice that it says in Matthew 4:23 that Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness among the people. Now, I show you this passage because we don't have a reference to Jesus actually being or ministering in Magdala. But Magdala is a Galilean city, and so Jesus would have certainly taught in their synagogues in Galilee, and this one in particular, which is just so cool when you show up to go, Jesus almost certainly taught in this synagogue right here. And it's a wonderful synagogue. It's not very big, but as you go around, you see some things that are very unique. You see a cat. Now, they don't let you walk in there without special permission, but apparently the cats can. But this actually provides you a perspective shot. And the cat is actually right next to what is known as the Magdala stone. It's this amazing archaeological find that hasn't been found in any other archaeological excavation of synagogues. It's where they believe the Torah scrolls were laid in order to read, or if you just got done reading the Torah scrolls, you'd set them down in order to teach, but you have that here. You also have mosaics over here, which starts to speak to the wealth and opulence of how the synagogue was decorated. I'll show you this a little bit closer. You can see these geometric designs here. Over here in a doorway area, you see frescoes. And so you see here that this was a very nice decorative synagogue that you have here at the site of Magdala. Now, this was found in 2009. And in December of 2021, an announcement went out that shocked everyone. And that was a second synagogue was found at Magdala, just on the other side of the street. So that structure is right here where we were just at. You go across the street, and this is a second synagogue. And the reason why this was so shocking is because in no other location when a synagogue has been found has a second synagogue been found in that particular town or city. And so Magdala is helping us to rethink through how synagogues were used in given towns and villages, especially a large city like Magdala. We know that there's at least two, and they're actually talking about likely finding more. And so you see the religious nature of Magdala, and you see something just really unique in a second synagogue. Now, when you start walking through the ruins, there's a lot to see, even though only 10% of Magdala has been excavated. And this is part of the market area where 28 different shops have been excavated. What's more is that they found cut stone basins where you would actually be able to choose which live fish you wanted. I'll take that tilapia, I'll take those sardines, I'll take this fish. It's amazing because this hasn't been found elsewhere. They also found water underneath the site. There is a spring that is taking water to where these basins are, and that's where the water is, fresh water for the fish from the Sea of Galilee. Now, you didn't have ice in the ancient world. You didn't have coolers, so the way that you preserved things like fish is that you packed them in salt. Magdala is the salt center around the Sea of Galilee. It's also where they smoked it in order to export it, both as smoked, also packed in salt. But apparently in the marketplace, you can get live fish. So this just speaks to the opulence, the wealth that you see in Magdala. As you walk through the ruins, here's a recent group walking through the ruins of Magdala. You see mikvahs, or mikvaot, plural, ritual immersion baths used in religious circles for cleanliness. And these are remarkably preserved, and the water from the springs underneath still flow into these mikvaot today. These are part of a couple of villas that are within the site itself, also speaking to the wealth and opulence of Magdala. And that's what I need you to have in your mind when you think of Magdala, is its wealth. It came from the fishing and salting industry. It came from boat manufacturing. So we're told that they manufactured boats in Magdala. We have obviously an amazing market with a lot of products coming from other parts of the world. One such thing that we know that they did in Magdala was glass, the blowing of glass. And there is evidence of that in the archaeological excavations. Josephus tells us that they did metal fabrication there. Now, this hasn't been attested yet in archaeology. There are remnants of leftover pieces of metal that may speak into this, but nothing definitive. But again, only 10% of the site has been excavated. But this was also part of the industry of Magdala that brought about wealth. Josephus also tells us they had a hippodrome. There's entertainment going on here, which now starts to mix like the religious nature of the Jews with the Hellenistic world of the pagans, because hippodrome was connected more to that Greco-Roman world. And so you've got that happening in Magdala. What's more is location, location, location. It's the trade routes. You have Magdala is right on the International Coastal Highway. It's also just 3.5 miles from Tiberias, and so they're in relationship with trade. That would have brought wealth to Magdala. And so with all of that in mind, I want to take you to a really amazing passage in Luke chapter 8. And in verses 1 through 3, we read this, that after this, Jesus traveled from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. Jesus had healed Mary, and that probably along with some other encounters, Mary just gave her life as a way of saying, I want to be a passionate follower of Jesus. You also have Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household, Susanna, and many others. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. So they are giving to the ministry of Jesus. Now, on the one hand, this is so deeply compelling, and I want to come back to that. On the other hand, this is also brings you to laughter. And here's why, is the reference to Chuza, the manager of Herod's household. Which Herod are we talking about here? We're talking about Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas is one of the 3 sons of Herod the Great that got territory after Herod died in 4 BC. You have Antipas, Philip, and then Archelaus, who was deposed in AD 6, replaced by a Roman governor and during the time of Jesus. This is Pilate, who has this jurisdiction right here. Antipas is the one who killed John the Baptist. Antipas is the one who is trying to eliminate Jesus and his ministry. And what gets recorded here is that as Antipas is residing in Tiberias with Chuza, his chief financial officer, Chuza's wife is actually taking the money that Herod Antipas has given her husband, and she is using it to fund the very ministry that Antipas is trying to squelch. So there's just a sense of like only God here could do this to help fund the ministry of Jesus. So there's just a sense of laughter when you see these connections here in this passage. But the other side of this as well is just how deeply compelling this is. Because as we talked in an earlier episode in our Rabbis and Disciples series, is that a rabbi would have a trade that they would use in order to make money when they were not traveling and teaching. But when a rabbi was itinerant like Jesus and would go out and about with their disciples, the way that their needs were met was through hospitality. People would give them a place to stay in their home. This is why Jesus is traveling with 12 male disciples, is because it was improper to be in close sleeping quarters between men and women. Jesus is with his disciples. There's 13 of them. That's a lot of hospitality. That's a lot of people giving food and shelter and the needs that they have. And one of the ways that people supported the ministry of Jesus was by giving him financial resources. And so when we've been talking about in this series, if Jesus is doing the majority of his ministry around the Sea of Galilee and he is itinerant, how are his needs and the needs of his disciples being met? The answer is through generosity and hospitality. And chief among those are these women who are funding the ministry of Jesus. And you have the wife of Chuza, who is here in Tiberias. You have Mary, who is in Magdala. And between here and Susanna and a few others, you have the bulk of the resources, at least recorded in the Gospels, of who is funding Jesus' ministry. And so Magdala and the wealth of Magdala and the fact that Mary is from Magdala, somehow she's connected into this wealth. Now, not everybody in Magdala is wealthy, but it seems to imply that Mary was wealthy and she used those resources as a way to help fund the ministry of Jesus. And it brings us to who's residing in Magdala, and that is a gospel patron. Now, this language I'm specifically using in connection to a brilliant book done by a guy by the name of John Reinhardt. Maybe some of you have seen this before. I got to meet John not long ago, and as we were talking, we figured out that we actually played against each other in college basketball in Los Angeles in 1999. So that was a fun connection to make. He's 6'7", I'm 5'9". Doesn't look like I belong on the court with him, but it was really cool to hear more of his story. But this book in particular has been significant to me for a number of years, and the premise is this: that when you look at key movements of the Bible in history, people know about William Tyndale, people know about George Whitefield, people know about John Newton, the writer of Amazing Grace and this incredible pastor. What people don't know about are Humphrey Monmouth and Lady Selina and John Thornton. That as God was raising up these major movements around the Bible, we remember the people who were doing the teaching. We remember the people that were doing the preaching. But in each of these cases, God brought forth someone with financial resources that was the gospel patron behind the movement in partnership with the face of the movement or the particular activity of the movement. And it talks about how they were working together, called by God to do something significant. And John recounts these gospel patrons. And so one of the things that John says in the book, which is so cool, he says, is this book only for the rich? Some have asked. No, God wants to see our faithful stewardship in little or much. So it's a book for all of us. And it's a book that I have read multiple times. And later on, John just says this. He says, in the ultimate example of gospel patronage, we see that God came among us, walked our dusty streets, ate our food, and got personally involved in our lives. God invested himself in the spread of the gospel. So should we. And this is the very essence of Mary Magdalene. This is the essence of Susanna, of the wife of Chuza, of others who were supporting Jesus in his ministry. They were gospel patrons, people who were invested in the kingdom projects. And you see this playing out in this amazing passage in Luke 8:1-3. And it just causes us to think in terms of in what way, shape, or form are we like Mary Magdalene? Are we using our resources in a way in order to fund, to participate, to invest in time, talent, treasure into the very things that spread the gospel here on earth? And it really begins to call into question how we use money. And so in addition to Gospel Patrons, I want to offer up one more resource that, if this stirs your heart, to read The Soul of Money by Lynn Twist. And she says this about what her understanding of biblical generosity began to do for her in her own life when she started using money differently. She just writes this, talking about her and her husband. Once we began to align our money decisions with these deeper core values and our highest commitments, we experienced a dramatic shift, not only in what we did with our money, but also in how we felt about money, about our life and about ourselves. Eventually, we came to know ourselves not for what we had or owned, but for what we gave, not for what we accumulated, but for what we allocated. It's a powerful quote around being a gospel patron, about being people who are intentional, about using what God has given us, our influence, our resources, our gift sets, to advance His purposes here on earth. And when you see the work that Jesus was doing around the Sea of Galilee, Mary Magdalene was part of that, not only as just a follower of Jesus, but one that was using the resources that God had given to her, and she was using them in the way to advance God's purposes in the world through Jesus' ministry. And so may we all see ourselves on mission to advance God's kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. That wherever God has placed us, whatever we have available to us, may we use those in a way that goes towards something that's ultimately going to last, and not just something that satisfies us for a season or for just a short period of time. So friends, that's how Jesus was able to do His ministry around the Sea of Galilee. We're the Gospel Patrons of Magdala, as well as Tiberias, as well as we don't know where the other people came from, but they were all doing what they could to see God's kingdom advance here on earth as it is in heaven. And it's what we're called to do as well. So friends, thanks so much for watching. Thanks for listening. And as always, may you walk out the text well in your life.